the silence that held 1,000 truths. The cameras were rolling. The set lights were warm, too warm, as if they were determined to melt the quiet off the man who sat across from the host. Keanu Reeves wore a calm smile, his hands lightly folded on his lap, eyes distant, reflective. He wasn't just answering questions tonight. Something was different. Something was about to surface. But to understand the moment the world was about to witness, his confession, the story that left millions stunned, we must go back. Not to the red carpets, not to the staged interviews, but to a private garden, a single laugh, a single promise, and a woman whose name could calm a storm in him. Sandra Bullock. Years earlier, long before their hearts had whispered truths even they weren't ready to hear, they had sat under a string of warm lights at a small outdoor wrap party. Speed had finished filming. The world hadn't seen the chemistry blooming behind those famous shots, but Keanu had, and Sandra had too. Only they were both too respectful, too humble, too frightened of ruining something sacred to act on it. And yet something had happened. Not the kind of story tabloids would print, not a scandal, not a wild affair, but a vow, quiet, tender, and wrapped in the golden haze of possibility. It had started with a joke. "Marry me then." Sandra had laughed when Keanu said no woman would put up with him disappearing on motorcycle rides for weeks. He had smiled, taken her wine glass from her hand, looked into her eyes, and said with all the strange seriousness of a man who'd been too alone for too long, "Then let's do it in our way. No pressure, no rings, just us." And she had whispered, almost afraid to break the spell, "Deal." That night there had been no witnesses, just the two of them, two broken hearts wrapped in laughter and unsaid dreams. There was no church, no paperwork, no photographers, just a silent promise, a soulful bond, and a kiss so brief that they both questioned it the next morning. But they remembered. Even when the years rolled by like trucks on a highway, even when they dated other people, even when life took them in opposite directions, they remembered. Keanu, always the stoic gentleman, carried her name like a prayer, through the loss of his daughter, through the grief of losing Jennifer, through the days of filming where he felt more like a machine than a man. He thought of Sandra. And Sandra, well, she hid it better, she laughed louder, dated harder, married and divorced. She built walls with charm and wit, but inside she had tucked away that one night, their marriage of souls. Years later, the world watched them in the lake house, and fans cried about their chemistry. But what they didn't know was that every line, every glance, every near kiss was haunted by the memory of a truth too fragile to name. And then came the letter. Keanu had been filming in Iceland, a role that drained him emotionally, physically. Alone in a cabin, surrounded by snow, silence, and thoughts, he received a letter with no return address. It was her handwriting. "Do you remember that night? I do, not because of what we said, but because of how safe I felt. I haven't felt that way since. So here's the deal. If you still mean it, meet me. July 16th, 7 p.m., that garden, same string lights." He read it 10 times. He arrived 10 minutes early. And there she was, Sandra, in jeans, a sweater, and a smile that broke his breath. She had aged, so had he, but the energy between them hadn't. She didn't speak. Neither did he. They just sat. Minutes passed. Then hours. Then came the moment she reached into her coat and pulled out a little velvet string. Inside was a simple silver ring. No church, no law, just us right. Keanu had nodded. That night no one saw them, no paparazzi, no guests. But they had married again, this time not just in spirit, but in truth. And yet they never told anyone. They were terrified the world would destroy something so pure. Until now. Until this interview. The host leaned in. "Keanu, there's been a lot of speculation, and I'll ask this only once. Are you and Sandra Bullock together?" He could have smiled, deflected, laughed it off. But instead, Keanu breathed in and spoke the words that made the world stop. "We've been married longer than anyone knows, not by law, but by love, and that's the only vow I've ever needed to keep." The studio fell into silence. He didn't say more. But he didn't have to. The look in his eyes held 1,000 nights of quiet love, 1,000 unspoken promises, 1,000 moments where a glance between them said what words never could. And somewhere, watching from her quiet home, Sandra Bullock smiled. Because the world finally knew what they had always known. Their story wasn't for headlines. It was for the heart. And it had just begun. The garden we never left. It was never about fame, not for him, and certainly not for her. For Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, the world had always been a stage they walked only because it gave them the chance to do what they loved. Acting, telling stories, transforming. But away from the rolling cameras and thundering applause, neither of them had ever truly belonged to Hollywood. They belonged to something quieter, something sacred, something not even time dared to touch. The day after the interview, the one where Keanu finally confirmed what the world had speculated and misunderstood for years, the internet exploded. Headlines flew like fireworks, screaming declarations of shock, romance, disbelief. But while the world talked, dissected, and debated, the two people at the center of it all were nowhere to be found. No follow-up statement, no public hand-holding, no magazine cover, just silence. Because for Keanu and Sandra, this wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't a rollout or a reveal. It was the gentle exhale of a truth they had guarded like a flame in a storm for nearly 2 decades. And now that it was out in the world, they did the only thing that ever made sense when the noise became too much. They disappeared. Back to the garden. That same quiet patch of earth where their souls had first touched without ever brushing fingers. The garden that had once been a wrap party set with string lights and folding chairs now stood, transformed into something deeply personal. A small wrought iron gate shielded the path. The lights had been replaced with softer, warmer ones that glowed like old fireflies, flickering in rhythm with their memories. Keanu walked slowly, every step echoing 1,000 before it. He wore the same dark jacket he had worn the night they'd made that first promise, a piece of time stitched into fabric. His hand carried a small brown envelope, something he had never dared show anyone before, not even her. And tonight he wasn't sure he'd be able to. But the truth had already begun to bloom, and some things, once set free, cannot be caged again. Sandra was already there. She always had a way of being early, not out of impatience but out of reverence. As if she believed certain moments required stillness before they could unfold. She sat on the old stone bench they had once shared, a mug of tea in her hands, her legs tucked under her like a child waiting for a bedtime story. She didn't look up when he approached. She didn't need to. "I didn't expect you to say it out loud," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that only relief could bring. "I didn't plan to," Keanu replied, taking a seat beside her. "But then I realized if I didn't, it would always feel like I was denying it, denying you, and I've done enough of that already." Sandra turned to face him. Her eyes were no longer the wide-eyed spark of the girl he had once laughed with on film sets and press tour. They were deeper now, softer, laced with lessons and love and losses neither of them ever talked about publicly. "You didn't deny me," she said. "You protected me and us, you always have." Keanu smiled faintly. "It's funny, isn't it? How we built a whole life in the margins of everyone else's. How we spoke in glances, kissed in memories, and loved in the silences between our movies. And yet no one ever suspected," she said. "They suspected," he corrected gently. "They just never imagined we would choose love without spotlight." There was a long pause. Sandra reached into her coat and pulled out a worn, folded piece of paper. Its edges were curled from being read too often. She handed it to him, and he unfolded it slowly. It was the same letter she had mailed him, the one that brought him back to this very bench. "I almost didn't send it," she confessed, her voice trembling now. "I thought maybe we'd missed our window, that maybe I was just being selfish, that you'd moved on." He looked up from the paper. "I never moved on, Sandra. I just moved quietly, always toward you." She closed her eyes, and for a moment the weight of years pressed against her shoulders. All the interviews where she'd smiled through questions about dating, all the red carpets walked beside people who didn't know her favorite song or why she hated February. She had buried so much beneath the armor of wit and charisma, but not with him, never with him. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope he had brought. He didn't speak as he handed it to her. She opened it slowly, carefully, almost afraid of what she might find. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, blurry at the edges. A shot of them years ago, leaning against an old car, laughing so hard their heads were thrown back, her hand on his chest, his hand in her hair. The world had been watching then, but this photo had never been published, because it wasn't taken by paparazzi. It was taken by a kid on set, a candid moment, a stolen time capsule. There was a note scribbled beneath it. "This is the moment I fell in love with you. I just didn't know how to say it then. Sandra stared at the photo for a long time, her breath caught not in sadness but in awe. This was their truth, their version of forever. It wasn't diamond rings or televised proposals, it was this. Letters, gardens, old photographs, quiet promises kept in chaos. I want to build something with you, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out like a confession. Not a mansion or a brand, just a life, a home, maybe a small place near water, a place where no one calls us actors, just two people who found each other again. He didn't answer with words. He just reached out and took her hand. And for a long time, they just sat there, the night curling around them like a lullaby. No flashbulbs. No interviews. No pretenses. Just a man and a woman who had always belonged to each other, finally letting the world know, and finally letting themselves believe they still had time. Some stories don't need chapters. They need gardens. They need old benches and handwritten letters, and one brave moment of truth after 1,000 days of silence. And in that moment, the stars above their heads seemed to shine a little brighter, as if they too had been waiting years to witness the moment Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves stepped fully into the love they had always shared, and finally called it home. Letters in the drawer, whispers in the wind. In the days following Keanu Reeves' quiet, soul-bearing revelation about his hidden bond with Sandra Bullock, the world shifted its gaze. Not with the scandal-seeking frenzy usually aimed at celebrity drama, but with a stunned reverence, as if something too sacred had accidentally been overheard. And yet the people closest to them, those who had shared dinners, flights, premieres, and griefs, began to reflect, putting together the pieces they had missed, or perhaps simply ignored out of respect for the unseen walls these two had so gently built around their connection. It was Octavia Spencer who said it first. Sitting on her back porch with her coffee untouched, she stared at the TV screen playing a loop of Keanu's confession and whispered to herself. They weren't hiding. They were protecting. She had known Sandra for decades, and while they never gossiped like others in the industry, Octavia had always sensed something sacred between Sandra and Keanu, something that existed in the air between them whenever they were in the same room. It wasn't romance in the way people usually understood it. It wasn't flirtation or PDA or breathless declarations. It was stillness. It was reverence. She remembered one particular night at a benefit dinner. Sandra had just presented an award and Keanu had arrived late, quietly sliding into the back. They never sat together. They didn't even exchange words in public that night. But when Sandra stepped off the stage and walked to her seat, she passed by Keanu, and their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. In that short silence, Octavia had seen more love than in all the publicized engagements and viral proposals she'd watched over the years. Now it all made sense. Meanwhile, back at Sandra's lakeside property, one of the few places the paparazzi had never managed to intrude, Sandra stood before a wooden drawer in her writing room. The drawer was locked, dusty, untouched for nearly 5 years. She stared at it, her fingers hovering over the small brass handle, almost afraid that opening it would mean reliving everything she had kept locked inside, not just paper, but memory, longing, regret, and time. But something in her chest urged her forward. She pulled. Inside there were 27 letters, all handwritten, all unopened, all addressed to Keanu. She had written them over the course of 12 years, not to be sent, not to be read, but to survive. Each letter had been written on days when the ache of missing him became too loud to silence, when pretending to be just friends felt like betrayal, when the thought of him with someone else created an earthquake behind her ribs. They weren't dramatic. They weren't poetic. They were real. Dear you, I saw your photo today. You looked tired. Your eyes looked the same. You always had those oceans in your eyes. I wonder if you ever look at me the same way when I'm not looking. I miss you. But I don't say it, because if I start, I won't stop. She sat on the floor beside the drawer, slowly pulling out each letter and reading them one by one, letting the old grief surface. Not to drown in it, but to free herself from it. By the time the sun had crossed the ceiling beams and settled lower into the sky, Sandra's lap was full of crumpled, tear-stained pages, and her heart was somehow lighter. In another room, Keanu stood by the window, watching the lake, sipping tea from a mug Sandra had given him years ago, the one with a faded S and a crack down the side. He didn't say much that day. He didn't need to. Sometimes the deepest healing doesn't come from talking, but from knowing that someone else is doing the same kind of remembering, somewhere else in the same house, at the same moment. That evening, they made dinner together. No cameras, no announcements, no pressure. Keanu chopped onions while Sandra stirred the pot. Every now and then their hands would brush when reaching for the same spoon. Each time they'd share a smile, soft, worn, knowing. It was domestic, intimate, not the stuff of red carpets but of real love, the kind that holds space for silence, the kind that grows not in luxury but in laughter shared over burnt toast. Later that night, curled under a shared blanket on the porch, Sandra leaned her head on his shoulder and asked, "Do you think we were cowards?" He looked at her, puzzled. For what? For waiting this long, for hiding, for not shouting from the rooftops. Keanu didn't answer immediately. He watched the stars reflected in the lake before responding. "No," he said. "I think we were gardeners. We waited for the right season. We let it grow underground so it wouldn't die in the storm." She smiled, her chest filling with something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The next day, Keanu opened his old leather journal, the one he carried through every film shoot, and began writing something new. Not a script, not poetry, just a reflection, a memory, a record of their truth. February 14th, 2003. We were in Vancouver. She was wearing that stupid fuzzy hat and laughing so hard at my terrible coffee. That's the day I knew I wanted her to be the one who grows old beside me. She never knew, or maybe she did. Maybe that's why she stayed close even when she dated others. Maybe we both knew we weren't ready to burn it all down just yet, but we're ready now. He closed the journal and tucked it away. Later that night, Sandra gave him something, a small locket. Inside was a photo, not of them, but of a book from the set of the lake house. It was a gift she had meant to give him years ago, but had kept postponing out of fear. The book was hollowed out on the inside, carved like a secret box. Inside, she had left a note sealed in wax. "In case you ever forget what we are." He opened it. It was a single line. "We are the silence between the words, the pause in the song, the breath before the I do." He looked at her and said, "Then I do, even now." And she replied, "So do I." They didn't kiss, they didn't cry. They just held hands, and for two people who had spent years pretending to be okay without one another, that simple touch was a revolution. The secret they carried, the dream she buried. World kept spinning. Headlines kept flashing, but in the heart of a quiet lakeside retreat, time had slowed. Maybe it had always been slower between them, less about clocks and calendars, more about presence. For Sandra and Keanu, the days that followed his public confession felt surreal, not because the truth was finally out, but because now, for the first time in decades, they no longer had to pretend, no longer had to speak in codes, no longer had to look away when their hands touched in public. And yet, letting go of years of silence wasn't as easy as opening a door. It was like stepping outside after a long storm, still wet from the rain, unsure if the sky would truly stay clear. That morning, Sandra woke to the sound of a piano, not a melody but a few wandering notes. It was Keanu, sitting barefoot on the old bench in the corner of the living room, gently pressing keys with no intention of composing, just trying to remember something. She didn't speak. She just stood at the archway, her robe wrapped loosely around her, watching him through the soft morning haze. It was one of those moments where nothing needed to happen because everything was already happening in the stillness. His fingers moved hesitantly, like he was searching for a memory trapped beneath the ivory. And then, after a few awkward pauses, a familiar sequence emerged. It was the song from The Lake House, the one that had played during the final scene when the timelines finally met, and the two lovers stood face to face at last. Her breath caught in her chest. He turned slowly, caught her watching, and smiled. "I never learned to play it properly," he said, "but it's been stuck in my head for years." She walked over and sat beside him. "You always remembered the important parts." Keanu looked at her for a long moment before responding. "So did you." They didn't play the whole song, just that one sequence, over and over again, like a mantra, a promise, a reminder of all they had lost and found in each other. Later that day, Sandra walked into her study and opened a box she hadn't touched since her 40th birthday. Inside were notes, sketches, journals, and a single folded sheet of paper yellowed at the edges. It was her dream, the one she had never told anyone about. A script barely outlined about two people who meet once every 10 years, always at the same spot, always in different circumstances, never remembering the last time, but somehow always falling in love again. She had written it years ago during a sleepless night in Italy. She had even written K and S in the corner of the first page, not thinking much of it at the time. But now it hit her. She had been writing about them all along, about their pattern, their emotional rhythm, their missed timings and silent confessions. It wasn't just a fantasy, it was their story. She brought it to Keanu that evening, and he read it quietly by the fireplace, the flames dancing in his eyes as if warming him from the inside out. When he finished, he looked at her with a softness she hadn't seen in years and said, "Let's do it." Sandra blinked. "Do what?" "Make this film together. No studios, no pressure, just us. Let the world see our rhythm the way we lived it, on our terms." She hesitated. "You sure this would be personal?" "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. "We've spent our lives hiding the most beautiful story we've ever known. Maybe it's time we share it, not for them, but for us." But before they could begin, the past came knocking. That night, Sandra's phone rang with a number she hadn't seen in years. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press the green button. "Hello," she said cautiously. A pause, then a warm, familiar voice filled her ear. "It's me. I saw the interview." Her throat tightened. It was Jesse, her ex-husband. The man she had divorced over a decade ago, the man who had been kind in some ways but never fully understood her. They hadn't spoken in years beyond obligatory legal matters. "I don't want anything," he said quickly, sensing her guard. I just wanted to say I get it now. I get why I always felt like I was standing in someone else's place." Sandra sat down slowly, silent. "I used to think you were just emotionally distant," he continued. "But now I realize you were just loyal, even in silence." She couldn't speak. Her eyes filled with tears, not because of pain, but because of how unexpected healing can sometimes arrive on the back of an old wound. "I hope you're happy," Jesse said finally. "Really, I hope he's everything you never thought you'd get to have." He hung up. Sandra sat in the quiet afterwards, stunned. Keanu entered the room carrying 2 cups of cocoa and found her eyes wet with emotion. He didn't ask. He didn't pry. He simply set the cups down and sat beside her, wrapping his arms around her gently, the way he always did when words failed. "Someone called to set me free," she whispered. "And did they?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Yes, but I didn't know I was still waiting." They sat in silence after that, listening to the wind rustle through the trees outside. A soft wind, a cleansing wind, the kind that moves the leaves without force, the kind that whispers to the soul, "It's safe now." The next morning, they sat on the back porch again, watching the fog roll off the lake. Sandra reached into her pocket and handed Keanu a small silver key. He looked at it, confused. "What's this?" he asked. "My second house in Wyoming," she said. "I've kept it empty all these years. I told everyone it was an investment, but I bought it after that first night in the garden." He stared at her, quiet. "I used to go there when I missed you," she continued. "I planted the same string lights, the same bench, everything." He took the key slowly, and now I want it to be ours. Not a gesture for show, not a symbol for social media, but a real step, a shared key, a shared life, a place to be nothing but 2 people who had always loved each other in the quietest, most faithful way possible. And in that moment, Keanu leaned in, not for a performance, not for a headline, but for the most honest kiss they had ever shared. A kiss that tasted like time, like home, like every letter she had never sent, and every word he had never said. And for the first time in all their years, there was nothing left between them but truth. The house that waited, the memory that wouldn't. The road to Wyoming curved like a ribbon through wilderness and memory, the kind of road that felt like it was carrying not just travelers but the weight of something sacred. Keanu drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting palm up on the center console, where Sandra's fingers had quietly found their place in his. They didn't speak for most of the drive, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence between them had grown into something almost holy. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had carried, everything they had hidden, and everything they were now finally brave enough to share. The landscape around them changed slowly, from city to stillness, from fame to freedom. Trees rose taller. Air turned cleaner. Time stretched out, no longer dictated by meetings or premieres or script readings. And when they finally pulled up to the cabin Sandra had kept all those years, her private refuge, her mirror of the garden where it all began, Keanu stepped out of the car and just stood there, stunned by how much it looked like the first place they had fallen in love. The house wasn't extravagant. It wasn't made for Instagram posts or design magazines. It was simple, 1-story, white-painted wood, a wide porch with 2 old rocking chairs, the same string lights, the same bench. Even the same wind chime dancing with the breeze and making that familiar tender sound that once played during a moment in Speed when they stood close together just before the camera cut away. It was all there, frozen in time, not as a replica, but as a memory made real. Sandra watched him absorb it all, her arms wrapped around herself not out of cold but out of nerves. She had never shown anyone this place, not even her sister, not even her assistant. This was her heart in house form, and now it was theirs. Keanu walked slowly to the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel, and ran his fingers along the railing like he was reading a story written into the wood grain. "You really kept this all these years?" he finally asked, his voice almost disbelieving. Sandra nodded. "Every year I'd come here for 2 days, sometimes 3. I'd sit out here and just talk to you, out loud, as if you were sitting right here. I used to imagine what we'd be like at 50, at 60. Whether you'd still disappear on your bike and whether I'd still try to organize your bookshelf every time you left a mess of scripts on the table." Keanu chuckled, that low, quiet laugh that always came from somewhere deep inside him. "I still do that," he admitted. "I've got 3 scripts sitting on my kitchen counter right now, untouched." Sandra smiled. "Good, some things should never change." They stepped inside. The place smelled like pine and memory. Old books lined the walls. A fireplace stood at the center, its hearth unlit but waiting, and near the back wall was a desk, hers, the one she used to write all those unsent letters, and beside it a stack of journals she'd never opened since writing them. Keanu reached for one, but she gently placed a hand on his. "Not yet," she said. "Some parts of me still need a little more time." He nodded. He understood. They had already traveled so far into each other's souls. Some doors, even in love, must be opened slowly. That night, as they sat by the fire sipping red wine from mismatched mugs, the topic that neither of them had spoken aloud finally found its voice. Sandra stared into the flames and whispered, "There's something I never told you, something I never told anyone." Keanu turned to her, his expression patient, present. She continued, her voice fragile. "Years ago, right after the proposal, I got pregnant." His eyes widened, but he said nothing. He listened. It was early. "I hadn't even told my team yet. I was scared, not because of the child, but because I didn't know how to tell you. We weren't together then, not officially. We weren't even in touch much, just little messages here and there, but I knew deep down it was yours." Her voice cracked. "I was going to tell you I had written a letter. I was planning to fly to you in Tokyo where you were shooting, but before I could, I lost it. Miscarriage, no warning, no signs, just gone." Keanu looked at her, frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He reached for her hand and she let him hold it tightly. "Why didn't you tell me then?" he asked softly, no anger, only pain. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of making you mourn something you never even knew you had," she said. "I wanted to protect you. I told myself it was kinder, but the truth is I was protecting me. I couldn't deal with what it meant, that we could have had a child, that we did, if only for a little while." The silence that followed was different from the silences before, heavier, thicker, full of ache. Keanu stood up slowly, walked across the room, and stared out into the night for a long moment. Sandra feared she had broken something between them, something they'd only just begun to rebuild. But then he turned around, his eyes shining, not with anger, not even sorrow, but a kind of reverence that took her breath away. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. "That child. They existed, and now I know, and I will remember, always." He walked back to her, knelt in front of her, and placed a hand on her abdomen, tenderly, reverently. "You carried a piece of us, that matters. Even if the world never saw them, I do. I see them. I love them. I love you." She broke down, not from guilt, but from the release of years of silence, of holding on to a pain she thought only she had carried. And in that cabin, surrounded by pine trees, firelight, and a love that had waited longer than most people have patience for, they grieved. Not just for the child, but for all the moments they had lost to fear, to pride, to timing. And then they healed, because that's what love does when it's real. It doesn't demand perfection, it simply stays. The next day, Keanu walked down to the small shed behind the cabin. Inside were some old tools, a hammock, and a box labeled K+S. He opened it and found photographs, ones Sandra had taken of him from afar. Notes she had written. A napkin from the restaurant where they'd once met between flights for a 5-minute goodbye. And at the bottom of the box was a sketch, a child's room layout, crib, soft toys, a rocking chair, and in the corner a little window facing the lake. Sandra had drawn it. Long ago, a dream she never dared to believe in fully. He took it upstairs, hung it quietly in the study, and said nothing. When Sandra found it later that evening, she didn't speak either. She just held him longer that night as they fell asleep. In Wyoming, they were not stars. They were not actors. They were not Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. They were simply 2 people who had once made a promise under string lights and had spent half a lifetime growing into the courage to finally keep it. And in that house, beneath the soft hum of wind and the creaking of old wood and the slow burn of forgiveness, they began again, not from scratch, but from truth. The vow that needed no witness. The snow came early that year in Wyoming. Not the kind that threatened or demanded attention, but a gentle drift, soft and slow, as if nature itself understood the intimacy of the moment unfolding in that quiet cabin near the lake. The world beyond the mountains still buzzed with curiosity, still speculated about what Keanu Reeves had meant when he told the world he and Sandra Bullock had been married by love for years. But neither of them responded. No clarifications. No photo shoots. No Netflix specials, because while the world screamed for proof, they had already found peace. In the days that followed their shared memory of loss, the child Sandra had carried, the unspoken grief they had both tucked deep inside, their love deepened in ways neither of them had expected. It was no longer tethered to the past or weighed down by what-ifs. It was present, strong, rooted. They woke together each morning without the armor of roles or scripts. Sandra would stand barefoot in the kitchen, humming softly while she brewed her tea. Keanu, always the early riser, would chop firewood just before sunrise, his silhouette framed by the smoky blue haze of dawn. These were the scenes of their real life, unrehearsed, sacred, and silent. The kind of life they'd been too afraid to choose in the prime of their fame, but now, in the stillness of middle age, they embraced it fully. One morning, Sandra walked into the living room holding a small leather-bound notebook she had tucked away for years. She handed it to Keanu without speaking. It was worn at the edges, weathered like the soul of someone who had waited a long time to be heard. Inside were notes from her years alone, dreams she'd written for the life she never thought she'd have. A garden, a child's laughter echoing through the woods, a table full of quiet dinners, her and him growing old slowly. Keanu read it with tears quietly rising in his eyes. He closed the book after the last page, then looked at her with something more powerful than any line he'd ever delivered on screen. "We already have this," he said. "Maybe not the child, not the laughter, but the rest of it. The love, the life, we already built it, even when we were apart, and now we get to live inside it together." And that's when the idea came. They didn't want another wedding. They didn't need papers or approval, but they both felt something stir, something unspoken. A need to reclaim what had always been theirs, not in front of a crowd, not even in front of friends. Just the two of them once more under string lights and sky, making a promise not to begin, but to remain. That evening they set it up together. Sandra gathered wildflowers from the edges of the lake and tied them with a ribbon she had once worn in her hair during a press junket years ago, the same day Keanu had whispered to her backstage that her smile was the most honest thing he'd ever seen. He brought out 2 candles, each one held in a glass jar they had painted during a road trip to Santa Fe. And between them, an old record player spinning slow jazz hummed through the pine-scented air. They stood beneath the lights, Keanu in a charcoal sweater, Sandra in a soft white shawl, no rings, no minister, just the moon as their witness and the ghosts of their shared history swirling around them like stardust. He took her hand and began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I loved you long before I understood what love truly was. I didn't chase you when I should have. I didn't speak when I should have shouted, but my silence never meant absence, it meant reverence. And every day I spent without you, I still walked toward you. I vow now not to start something new, but to never again step away from what we've always had. Quiet, steady, eternal." Sandra looked at him, her eyes holding oceans, and spoke slowly, her voice like silk. "I was afraid for so long, afraid that what we had was too rare to survive the world outside our silence. So I buried it, protected it, guarded it. But the truth is, love doesn't need protection, it needs courage. And today I vow to no longer fear what is already mine. You are my safe, my soft place, my home. I vow to live in the light of you, fully, freely, finally." They leaned in, foreheads touching, breaths mingling, and in that moment they sealed their vow, not with a kiss, but with stillness. Because sometimes the loudest kind of love is the kind that needs no sound at all. In the weeks that followed, they stayed in the cabin, away from the cameras, away from the noise. Sandra began writing again, not for studios, but for herself. Poems, sketches, small stories carved from fragments of memory. Keanu started carving wooden sculptures by the shed, figures of trees, hands, a woman with a wind-blown scarf. They built a life from the inside out. And then one day, he sat at his old desk, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote something, not for publication, not for the world, but for the future. A letter titled simply, "For When I'm Gone." If you are reading this, then I am no longer beside you, but I promise I never really left. I stayed in every book you loved, every pine tree outside that window, every echo of our laughter in the walls of our home. I never thought I'd find you, but I did. And I would find you again in every lifetime because you were not just my love. You were the part of me that taught me how to live. He sealed it in an envelope and placed it under the floorboard beneath their shared bed, marked only with a tiny ink heart. Years passed. They returned to public life from time to time, appearing at film festivals, charity events, sometimes caught by a lens walking hand in hand through a bookstore or sharing gelato in Rome. But they never spoke again publicly about the marriage. Because to them, it had never been a performance. It had been a soul contract, and it was never meant for applause. In the end, their legacy wasn't built on box office records or awards. It was built on patience, on years of quiet devotion, on letters never sent and vows never broken. And for those who still ask, even now, if Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock were ever truly married, the answer is simple. They were. Just not in the way most people understand. They married in glances, in gardens, in loss and in rediscovery. They married in silence. And they stayed married through it all.